This morning we get to talk about dreams. And the minute I say that, you begin thinking about what the last one was that you had, right? Maybe you had one last night. When I was preparing for this morning, I thought, what's the dream that sort of has stuck with me over the years? And I remember when I was a little tiny kid, my parents told me about a really brutal traffic accident that happened in our family, and how the person who rear-ended the car and caused the death of all the occupants in our family was drunk. Shortly after that, I began to have this recurring dream. And the dream was that I was sitting in the front seat of a car, and we were sailing down the highway, and suddenly the car in front of us would stop, and we wouldn't be able to stop, and just before we'd hit, I would wake up. Ah! Imagine how joyful an experience it was when Rose, shortly after we got married, experienced me having this dream. I literally stood up in bed, and she wondered, what in the world is wrong with you? And I said, it's that dream. She said, you never told me about this dream. I know, it's embarrassing. I don't know why I continue to have it. And so Rose put her hand on my head, and she prayed for me, and I haven't had that dream since. But those aren't the only dreams I had, and I'm not going to bore you with the other ones. But my guess is that while I was talking about that dream, you were probably thinking about dreams that you have. You know, those dreams where you're running and you can't get anywhere? Or you're falling and just before you hit, you wake up? Or what about those dreams that, wow, if you had to tell what they were, they'd be kind of embarrassing. How does that all happen? And how important are dreams anyway? This morning, I want to talk to you about dreams that actually change histories, and how you can differentiate between a godly dream and maybe just a little too much pizza the night before. So, what do you dream? Go ahead, take a minute to think about it. What do you dream? And what do your dreams actually mean? Some of those dreams that you have, you never ask anybody about. They're just silly dreams. But sometimes, while you're making your coffee in the morning, and your brow is kind of furrowed, and you look kind of perplexed, somebody in the family comes downstairs and kind of looks at your face and says, is there something wrong? No, everything's fine. No, really, is there something wrong? Well, I had this dream. While I make the coffee, can I explain it to you and see if you can tell me what you think it means? Usually when you get to that level, you already know or have a suspicion as to what the dream means. It's always nice to maybe have a confirmation or at least have somebody else's opinion. So what do dreams really do? Well, they may bring, if you're a Jungian psychiatrist, they may bring the subconscious to the conscious. In other words, things that you wouldn't normally express, kind of way down deep in your soul, not a psychiatric term, by the way, but those things that are hidden and maybe secret, kind of spring forth into your consciousness during that dream. Dreams have varying value. Like I said, that terrifying dream that I used to have about being in a car crash and almost dying versus a little too many jalapenos on the meat lover's pizza. They can dramatically and profoundly affect present and future history. If you pay attention to dreams, like when you're watching television and the commercial comes up for the California psychics, to tell you that they can tell you what your dreams mean? Well, they can dramatically alter what you're thinking, what you're doing, what your future might be. Or they can have no effect at all. So let's talk about this dream or these two dreams actually, that changed history. And let's first talk about Pharaoh's history. So we have fat cows and lean cows. In fact, didn't you like the fat, plump, attractive cows? That was quite a nice description, wasn't it? And then you had the lean, ugly cows. And when I was reading the text this week, all I could think of was being in the locker room in my high school days and the guy saying, U-G-L-Y, ugly. Your mama says you're ugly. And I'm thinking, oh man, that's terrible. Have you ever had a dream with carnivorous cows? When Rose and I lived in Wisconsin, we used to be able to go to Babcock Hall where they had cows that they'd actually cut holes in their ribs and put plastic kind of Tupperware type things there so that they could reach in and sample. I know, poor Janny's back there going, what? They could actually sample what's going on in the stomachs of the cows. You know, they have two stomachs, right? They're herbivores. But carnivorous cows? As you were reading it, or maybe even Pharaoh was wondering, is my next dream going to be about zombies? Well, it doesn't get any better, because then you have this beautiful grain that everybody wants to harvest, eaten by blighted, wind-killed grain. And in both those stories, the blighted and the ugly don't get any better looking for having a good meal. This is a crazy dream. But Pharaoh feels that there's some kind of significance about this. So he thinks about the fat cows, and he thinks about the full grain, and he thinks about the lean cows, and he thinks about the thin grain, and he wonders, what does this mean? And no one can tell him. Now, if you had been on the scene, would you have been able to say something? I certainly would have wondered. So while he's, pun intended, ruminating about this, somebody says, wait a minute, I know somebody who can probably interpret your dream. I had forgotten about him until just now, but you might remember a few years ago that, and he goes to tell the story of the cupbearer and the baker. So Pharaoh says, get him. I want to know what he has to say. What happens from that point on is so transformative for North Africa that its effect probably lasted until the 1940s. I mean, the 1940s that some of us are familiar with. So this Pharaoh, Sesostris III, his decision to know his dream makes him a powerful and influential Pharaoh. One of the most powerful in the ancient Near East, especially in North Africa. But what about Joseph? His history was changed too. He gets to talk about abundance and famine. He gets to talk about the interpretation that he gets and the discernment that he uses in being able to interpret the dream. He goes from being a prisoner to a power broker in the kingdom. He gains integrity, respect, and trust. And he becomes very wealthy, influential, and powerful. And where did he come from? Being falsely accused of hitting on his boss's wife and spending many years in prison. Think about the transformation that took place within minutes. That dream changed his history, just as it changed Pharaoh's. And I already alluded to this, but it also changed North African history. During the time that we're talking about, famine clearly caused the collapse of many ancient kingdoms. It says everybody in the land was coming to Egypt to get food. And in fact, some people, like Joseph's birth family, came twice. The planning that was occasioned gave dominance to Egypt. In other words, it became the central power during the time. And Joseph reform became a North African phenomenon. In fact, people who study agriculture talk about the Joseph effect. And how, as we look at weather cycles, we can actually plan for times of plenty and times of poverty. So this is really quite a spectacular passage, worth reading the whole thing, even though you have to pronounce Egyptian names. So the question, I think, comes to us, can godly dreams help us fulfill our purpose? Because that's what this whole series is about this summer, the series on Joseph. What's the purpose that God is trying to work out in the trials of our lives? Can these dreams help fulfill our purpose by changing us, our world, and the histories that are created by the changes that take place? Well, stop and think about this for a minute. As we were reading through the text, you probably did an aha moment at the 16th verse in the 41st chapter. It tells us that godly dreams actually inspire submission to God's plan. Look at what the verse says. I can't do it, Joseph says, when Pharaoh says, can you interpret the dream? I can't do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Think about the temptation that you and I face when we're asked by somebody to do something important. Yeah. This is my moment to shine. Here I am. All of my talents and skills are on display. Let me at it. Is that what Joseph approaches this moment as? It doesn't say that he's shaking or that he's fearful. In fact, you get the sense that he's supremely confident, but not in himself. Because he's submitted to God, he's confident in God. He says, I can't do it, but God can. The minute that happens, whether you like it or not, you become a testimony. You become a testimony to your own ego, and you become a testimony to God's greatness. Think about that the next time you find yourself in one of those moments where this could be really self-aggrandizing. Your temptation is gonna say to you, I did this. Or like that old crooner's ballad, I did it my way. Because that's what our culture is looking for. Sometimes covert, sometimes extrovert narcissists who are willing to say, I did it. But where are the people who truly trust in God and see their lives change, the lives of people around them change, and history change because they're willing to be submissive to God's will? There's another verse that came up too. It's a little bit later on in around the 28th verse. It simply reads, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. And that intimates the sovereignty of God. If you're just thinking on the subjective for the first point that I tried to make this morning, here's where it gets a little bit more objective. God is in control. We read it in our psalm this morning. We read it in the gospel passage where Jesus invites people to come and cast their burdens on him because he's in control. Surely, after the interpretation of the dream, Pharaoh began to think a little less of himself, because the pharaohs thought of themselves as gods, and a little more about the deity that Joseph was testifying to. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. You know, power is an interesting thing, isn't it? I remember living in North Carolina and being asked to take one of the bishops from Africa from the place where I was to Greenville, South Carolina. And I thought, what a wonderful opportunity, a real cross-cultural experience for about 3 hours in the car together. This is awesome. So as we were traveling along, I got a phone call, begged the bishop's pardon and took the phone call, and it was someone asking me to take a ministry position. When I was finished, I hung up the phone, and the bishop immediately said, "So, who was that?" And I said, "Well," and I told him the name, and he said, "Oh, I know that name. What are they asking you to do?" I said, "Well, they're asking me to do a particular kind of a job." And the bishop said, "Oh, then you must do it." And I said, words that I've never uttered since, "Pardon me, bishop, but you're not my bishop." And in true African form, the bishop turned to me and he said, "When I am in your car, I am your bishop." When I'm Lord over the cosmos, and when I'm Lord over history, and when I'm Lord over every single person that lives, I have power. That's really what God is saying when he identifies himself as the I am. And what was happening in this story this morning was that God was identifying himself as the I am. Joseph understood it, being in submission to God. He understood something that Pharaoh couldn't. So Joseph had to say, God is going to do something, Pharaoh. This is what he's about to do. You can't stop it. You ever find yourself in a position where you want to say, "Stop, God. I've had enough. I would rather do it another way. Why me, Lord?" If you've ever found yourself in that kind of a position, you've been in the Pharaoh spot. But if you've been willing to say, God's going to take care of this, and I'm simply going to submit to it, now you're in the Joseph spot. The dream is becoming more and more godly as it goes along. Look at the next passage. It's the 39th and 40th verse. "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge, and all my people are to submit to your orders." And you can just almost feel Joseph's head going. But his view of God helps this happen. And he's back to being submissive Joseph. You know, when God does things in our lives, he is initiating solutions. Because he's not a God without a plan. His plan, his purpose, is to be worked out in our lives. And that is our greatest goal. It's not something you learn when you're tiny. You know, there's the terrible twos and the terrific threes. Some people never grow out of those, by the way. But as you get older, and hopefully wiser, as you find more of what it means to submit to a sovereign God who loves you, who cares for you, who only wants the best for you, rather than say, why me, God? You say, what can I learn? In other words, God, you have the solution. Please initiate it in my life so I can see what's going on. I used to climb in the car and go for long drives when I was asking the why me, Lord questions. Those long drives were good because I found that my question would change as the longer I drove. Okay, what do you want to teach me? Help me see things like you do. Give me a perspective all the way around like you have. Show me what the possible outcomes could be and how what I feel is horrible at the moment could be holy for the rest of my life. Years ago, when I started asking that second question, I started getting up in the morning saying, God, I'm yours. This is the day that you've made. I'll rejoice and be glad in it. Use me any way you wish. That was terrible for my schedule, but it was wonderful for my life and ministry. Finally, and this verse wasn't in our reading this morning, you'll get this verse next week. It's chapter 43, verse 29. God be gracious to you. Pastor Bill, there's no grace in the Old Testament. It's just law and judgment. And no, there's grace in the Old Testament. And I'll explain more what that means next week. But the reason why I wanted to put it up for you is because I wanted you to hear the rest of the story about godly dreams. They always impart salvation. There's always a healing that's about to take place. There's always a reconciliation that's about to spring forth. There's always an opportunity for transformation and change. Don't ever doubt it. Because God is in the process of working out his purpose in our lives, he will never let us down. If we're willing to submit to him and understand his sovereign work in our lives, if we're willing to let him do the strategizing and the planning and cooperate with him, or as Blackaby says, find out where God is at work and join him there, then it will be salvation to us. If not, it will be fear and heartache and difficulty and ruin. There are two lineages in the Bible in one particular point in the Old Testament, and they both start out with names that mean about the same thing. But after 10 generations, one ends up with a name that means pining, and the other ends up with a word that means salvation. Remember those Choose Your Destiny books? Some of that is true. You do get to choose. And all of it, when you know God, is based on the one who's in control. So when you're trying to differentiate between the pizza and the jalapenos and its effect on your dream life, and something like this passage that we read this morning, or something that occurs in your life where you really have a sense that God is at work, choose the latter. Be submissive to him. Understand his sovereignty is at work in your life. Let him do the strategizing. Because ultimately, it's working to your salvation. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Thank you. Thank you that we can discover our purpose by letting godly dreams change us, our world, and our histories for our good and for your glory. I know almost everybody in this room has something that's akin to this dream that needed interpreting and discernment in your touch. Lord, I pray right now, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that you will begin to bring healing and reconciliation and grace for your honor and glory. Amen.
Amen.
By the way, when God's doing this kind of work in your life, pay attention.